Hi everyone, in this video I will discuss about indigenous psychology as one of the three approaches used in psychology in relation to culture. But first off, let's talk about these questions. What is smart? What do you think is smart? What do you think makes people smart? And in what situation can you show your smartness off? Reflect on your own experience in life and start answering this question on your own. Chances are some of you might think about the academic smart, the book smart, but perhaps some other would also think about the life smart, the practical smart. Now, if we look into some research about intelligence across culture, we will see that actually intelligence could be defined in different ways across culture. The conventional definition of intelligence is that intelligence is seen in terms of practical problem solving, verbal ability, and social competence. Typically, to measure intelligence, we use some standardized tests. However, in other cultures, like in China, the Chinese philosophies on the concept of intelligence, the Confucian emphasized benevolence and doing what's right to define intelligence, while the Taoism emphasized humility, freedom from conventional standards of judgment, full of knowledge of oneself and external conditions. So here we can see that according to these two philosophies, intelligence are not necessarily mean to be practical problem-solving skills or verbal ability or social competence, but it could be something that's related to someone's character, someone's personality, and also the understanding of the situation around this person. In rural Kenya, there are 4 distinct terms of intelligence. They have Rieko, that's the knowledge and skill, Luoro, that's the respect, Winjo, that's comprehension of how to handle real-life problems, and Paro, initiative, which means that in Kenya itself, there are 4 different ways to define intelligence. So, if intelligence is not defined the same way across cultures, why should we rely on the same concept and method to measure intelligence using the standardized tests that typically are transported from the Western culture into different contexts, being translated and then modified to fit into that local culture? So indigenous psychology was developed at the first place to sort of answer those challenges, those questions about the contextual content of psychology. The definition of indigenous psychology is it is the scientific study of human behavior or mind that is native, that is not transported from other regions, and that is designed for its people. In other words, indigenous psychology is study of human behavior and mind that is developed by and for the people of each particular local cultural context. The goal of indigenous psychology is to construct not only providing description, theories about psychological phenomena. How? By creating a more rigorous, systematic, universal science that can be theoretically and empirically verified. Indigenous psychology also advocates examining explicitly both the content and also the context of research. In indigenous psychology, individuals are viewed as agents of their action and collective agents through their culture. So there's dynamic relations between the individuals and also the culture, and the environment, the event, the situation, as well as the behavior are both observable. So what are the steps to achieve the goal of indigenous psychology? First, for sure, researcher needs to provide a descriptive understanding of human functioning and then develop theories and concepts that could explain the observed regularities, and then creating a more rigorous, systematic, and universal science that can be theoretically and empirically verified. There are several characteristics of indigenous psychology. First, it emphasizes examining psychological phenomena in the context. For example, some of the themes that have been studied using indigenous psychology approach is leadership, happiness, trust, and even personality. So for example, if someone would like to study about happiness, this researcher should not only transport the concept from the Western culture, should not only use the existing, more established theory, but he or she must develop happiness theory from its local cultural context. So the researcher must start from scratch, must first ask about happiness to the local people in that particular culture, to develop theory about happiness for the people of that particular culture. The second characteristic of indigenous psychology is that indigenous psychologies are not the studies of native people, ethnic groups, or people living in third world countries. Basically, all of the psychological studies are indigenous psychology. So if we would think about it, then we would say that the existing psychological theories and concepts that we typically use now are actually the indigenous Euro-American psychology. So it is also indigenous psychology, but for the Euro-American cultural context that may not be applicable for other cultural contexts. So it's not only study about particular ethnic groups or minority groups or people living in specific regions in the world, but it's basically everything is indigenous psychology. The third characteristic is that indigenous psychology does not affirm the use of a particular method. So in indigenous psychology, researchers can use any methods because the goal of indigenous psychology is actually not only using the established method, but the goal is to find the appropriate methods to investigate a phenomenon that is most suitable for that particular cultural context. The next characteristic of indigenous psychology is that it uses both internal and external points of view to understand the indigenous and cultural phenomena. So here, we are not only digging the issue from the local context, but also we are trying to understand the local context, the phenomenon in a particular culture, using the typical ways that we tend to do. For example, to disseminate our research, what is the easiest way to make other people from other culture understand about our results? For example, we can use numbers. So we are using the external points of view. So instead of using narratives to explain our results, we can use numbers because maybe numbers is easier to understand. If we, for example, put some statistic results, most of the scholars, the academia in the world who are studying psychology, they could understand the meaning of those statistical results. So in this case, we are also using the external points of view to understand the indigenous and cultural phenomena. And then the role of the indigenous psychology researchers is to translate episodic knowledge into analytic forms so that they could be tested and verified. So the role of the researchers here are really crucial to make other people from different cultural contexts understand about the psychology of that people, of that particular cultural context. And we need to disseminate it. We need to use analytic forms so that other people who may not be from that culture can also test and evaluate, empirically study the results that the researchers already obtained from that particular culture. Another characteristic of indigenous psychology is that some indigenous concepts have been analyzed as examples of indigenous psychology, such as Amai in Japan or Sabar in Indonesia. Next is many indigenous psychologists search philosophical and religious texts to explain indigenous phenomena, which is typical and have been done by many scholars. However, indigenous psychology scholars still want these reviews to be empirically tested and validated. So not only stopped in the review activity only, but also really testing and validating whether this philosophical and religious texts actually explain the behaviors of the people in that culture. Indigenous psychology is identified as a part of the cultural sciences tradition, which we already know. It advocates a linkage of humanities such as philosophy, history, religion, literature that is related to human behavior with social sciences, which focus on the analytical knowledge, empirical analysis, and verification. The last characteristic of indigenous psychology is that it starts from two starting points. One is the indigenization from without, and the other one is the indigenization from within. Indigenization from without using a more top-down approach, that is by transporting theories and concepts from outside world and modifying them to fit into the local cultural context. However, what is advocated more by the indigenous psychology is the indigenization from within. That's using the bottom-up approach, in which we are really digging into the local culture and trying to explain it using the theories that is easier to be understood by people from the outside world. So, how is the position of indigenous psychology in comparison to cross-cultural psychology and cultural psychology? We have learned in previous meetings that cross-cultural psychologists use a more universalist approach, where they try to understand differences, but at the same time, they're also trying to see similarities across culture. Cultural psychologists is the opposite. They want to just understand the people in the context, in the local context itself, without thinking about searching for similarities between one context and another, or differences between one context and another. They just want to understand human behavior and mind in each particular culture. While the indigenous psychology actually uses both approaches. It's universalist and also contextualist. It's contextualist, it's also universalist. So indigenous psychology claims that it is using integrationist approach because it is trying to understand people in the context, but at the same time also trying to understand whether people in different contexts have similarities and maybe differences, and also trying to develop theories that can be universally understood by people inside the culture itself and also people from outside the culture. Next, I would also like to talk about one research example that was done by Lestari, Fatur Rahman, and Kim about trust in parent-child relationship among undergraduate students, indigenous psychological analysis. The objective of this study was to describe the pattern of trust in parent-child relationship and to capture the reason of why children trust their parents. Why we needed this study? Because there might be different patterns of parent-child relationship between the Indonesian, especially the Japanese family context, and the typical Western family context. So in Japanese family context, there are some philosophical guidance to guide the relationship between parent and child. For example, about child respect to their parents, the language that they must use, and also the honor that the parents need, that the children need to carry, and also some emotional relationship that might not be easily understood by people outside of the Japanese cultural context, like unconditional love, like isin or shame, and also sungkan, the hesitance to do some actions or to say something that is inappropriate in a particular context. So the researchers in this study used some questionnaire. It had basically 4 questions. Yeah. How much do you trust your father? How much do you trust your mother? So these 2 are quantitative questions. Yeah. And there are 2 other qualitative questions that's in the form of open-ended questions. Why do you trust your father or mother? There were 550 undergraduate students in Jogja who participated in the study, and the data analysis used both categorization and coding of the open-ended responses, and also some statistical analysis. They use cross-tabulation, regression, t-test, and also ANOVA. The results from the open-ended questions showed that the basis of trust to father included some of these themes: support, emotional bonding, modeling, role of relationship, honesty, and reliability. While basis of trust for mother, based on the open-ended question, was emotional bonding first, and then support, and the role of relationship, reliability, honesty, and modeling. In a more quantitative analysis, they cross-tabulated the theme, the categories that they found from the open-ended questionnaires with the child's gender, parental education, parental occupation, and standard of living. So they found that only standard of living was significant to differentiate the theme of the basis of trust to father and to mother. While the t-test of the level of trust, you remember the quantitative questions, showed that trust to mother was significantly higher than trust to father. The multiple regression results show that all factors of the basis of trust were significant predictors to level of trust to father. So here, the support and emotional bonding predicted trust stronger than other factors to both father and mother. This study described parent-child relationship in Japanese family that includes instrumental, relational, and emotional relationship. The support role of relationship and modeling were not typically discussed in previous studies that was done in different cultural contexts. So then the next question is, if the indigenous psychology movement started in the 90s, is there any development of the methods or theories at this time? So there is a different way, like there's a development of the methods that can be done in indigenous psychology, that is using cross-cultural indigenous psychology. Basically, indigenous psychology approach that is done in different cultural contexts at once. So here the goal is to find empirical integration to integrate common characteristics such as component, process, construct, structure, or pattern, and the functions possessed by all the indigenous psychology being compared, and also to integrate theory, so developing theories that can understand, explain, and predict psychological phenomena and behaviors in a specific domain, such as happiness, in 2 or more cultural contexts. So here, the goal of the integration will be achieved. For the Indonesian multicultural context, where we have many ethnic groups, The cross-cultural indigenous psychology approach is considered to be most suitable so that we can perhaps develop theories that can explain the psychology of the Indonesian people, but at the same time also considering the differences, the multicultural differences across ethnic groups in Indonesia. So if you would like to read in more detail about indigenous psychology and also in comparison with the other approaches of the psychology of the culture, then you can see these references. Thank you.